APAC and EMEA are unable to provide a common set of financials or even goals to the new CEO. Second example would be a senior leader taking an assignment from New York to London without fully considering the tax consequences of a significant bonus or equity payout. The assignment was initiated in the US without involving global mobility at all, and subsequently the team were unable to have a discussion with the tax teams about avoiding or mitigating against significant tax liability. Of course, the assignment starts 2 weeks in London before the individual gets his bonus, so there is a significant tax charge incurred, which could have been avoided if they'd simply engaged with mobility a little bit earlier on. And then finally, which happens very often, a very talented high potential takes an assignment for 2 years, moves from London to Singapore, and during that time, unfortunately, their line manager in the UK leaves the business. And there's no formal mentoring or coaching support going on during this assignment, so of course there's no real visibility to this applicant when they return. When they repatriate, without some visibility before, during, and after the assignment, of course, they very quickly lose this promotional velocity that they probably would have had if it wasn't for the fact that they were basically unknown when they were on assignment in Singapore, and they quickly become very disillusioned with the company, and they leave for their competitor. Now, if you can't see the wood for the trees with your mobility program, these scenarios are all very real and can be very damaging, because of course they have real consequences, whether it's reputational in terms of your CEO, it could be financial with increased tax liability, or probably what hurts us all the most, which is losing top talent. So you kind of have to ask yourself, when you look at your global mobility program within your organization, do you see just the trees, or do you see the wood, the ecosystem, all the individual parts and components that come together to form the wider picture, that complement each other, that support and sustain each other? Because all too often, senior HR mobility tend to just focus on just a few elements, whether it's policy, benchmarking, or simply just customer satisfaction scores, when you're missing the opportunity to take a step back, like we discussed before, and having a different perspective, and seeing how actually mobility integrates into the wider business. Without doing that, without having that effective integration, you risk the chance of losing talent, losing time, losing resources, and critically reputation too. So those scenarios really describe mobility as a very complex function, which it is, and highlights the fact that how important it is that it's intertwined with the other processes within the business. What I've taken here is I've actually extracted one of the diagrams from one of our toolkits that we use within our consultancy practice, and this actually highlights 7 key areas that we without an internal holistic analysis from an alternative perspective. Quite commonly, you can also obviously engage with third-party consultancies to do the same analysis. And the second approach I would recommend would be to go down the route of comparing. So often that just takes the form of policy benchmarking, but that really isn't enough when it comes to looking holistically at a mobility program. You have to take it a step further and actually look at structural benchmarking. So that would give you an insight to whether or not there is a requirement for a centre of expertise, a shared service centre, or even probably what's the best fit from a centralised and decentralised perspective for your program. But it is important to note with that route, you certainly have to have quite a deep level of contacts within your industry sector network. Because if you don't, of course, you're not necessarily going to get the data that you need, and you also need a reasonable amount of participation from your competitors. So that latter approach often does lend itself more to an outsourced solution. But whichever direction you go in within the mobility program to take that holistic look, it really is often determined by the internal resources you have and what your corporate culture is. But either one of those options absolutely will take you more towards a position of optimization and integration. So if we look at the initial structure we had up originally, as you can see, we've got the old chair there, a wheelbarrow, a guitar, maybe a pepper shaker, no real cohesion, dysfunctional, not very integrated or aligned. But then all of a sudden, very slowly, it comes together and integrates. And the dysfunction